This lecture will look at the circumstances surrounding the emergence of the first modern art style, known as realism, during the revolutions of 1848. Now, the late 19th century will witness the full effects and feel the full effects of the Industrial Revolution, whereby, just to show you a map here of the industrialization of Europe, we now have cities of over 1 million people in London and Paris, and of course populations exploding elsewhere. The railroads are going to connect these vast distances, such as between Glasgow and London, or Paris with Amsterdam, allowing people greater freedom and more mobility. The same can be said for the United States, where we find New York also has a population of 1 million people at this time, and railways are going to be connecting it down through Philadelphia and DC. Modernity as we know it coincides with the modern art movements known as modernism. So by the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution, these technologies are going to be fully felt throughout the Western European and American world. You find that the demand for coal and iron is going to skyrocket at this time because they fuel everything that is going to make modernity modern. So we have improved mining and metallurgy techniques and improved transportation to move these massive amounts of thousands of tons of raw material of coal and iron coming from areas that are the colonies of these major European nations. Thus, the locomotive and the steamship will lead to the growth of cities and population migration from rural areas to urban areas because that is where the jobs are located, and then, like today, people will always go where the jobs are. Now, the Enlightenment, as we have discussed, connected this movement that began in the late 17th century, connected this notion that if we put our faith in science, then we will progress as a civilization, as a species, that things will get better. And so, in many ways, it did. We had new objects, cheaper merchandise. We can move more rapidly. We can afford more things. We can go more places. However, the lack of control and restraint placed upon these industrialists that own these factories led to the exploitation of the working class and is going to sow the seeds of revolution in 1848 we will discuss today. It was in that year that Karl Marx wrote his very famous Communist Manifesto. The German author is going to believe that the working class, the proletariat, is being exploited by the class that owns the means of production. So he advocated the seizure of power by the working class, a system, a political system that will eventually lead to and be adopted by the Russians, known as communism. Now, this is going to be at the same time we find the rise of imperialism, where every major European industrial and American power will need the raw materials for industrialization. Therefore, they had to exploit areas in Africa and Asia which were rich with these materials. So we find that they were all divided up between England, France, Spain, Germany, America, Austria, and so forth. You find that geologists at this time, while we're expanding, are now going to discover that the world is actually older than 6,000 years, which was, of course, going to be backed up by Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, that also will state that life evolves through natural selection. So, first off, we find that scientists are going to be questioning the veracity of religious texts such as the Bible that claims the earth is only 6,000 years old, which leads to an entire scientific revolution and upheaval again in the 19th century when we begin to suggest what evolution might mean for our species. And then finally, the social dimension is that if in fact people can believe that species evolve and that, as Darwin states, you find that it's survival of the fittest, that being the ones that are the most appropriately tasked to survive in their given environment, Therefore, Anglo-Saxon upper-class individuals, the Caucasians of the Western world, believe that they were put there through social Darwinism because they were the most equipped to succeed, the fittest. So we have this pseudo-scientific argument that the Caucasian Western nations of Europe have the right to subdue and to control Africa and Asia because they are not as advanced, they are not industrialized. Now, it was at this time where we have these explosions in technology and with the materials to make it happen and to actually support it, that the scientific inventions we're all familiar with were actually created. Not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. Everything that led to these major innovations that we know today. The telegraph was invented and helped the Union win the Civil War, for instance. We could communicate across vast distances immediately. The telephone is invented in the 19th century. And of course, fun fact, Thomas Edison suggested that we shouldn't say hello, but ahoy. Then you have the radio. So now we can actually send radio signals and sound waves across vast distances. Electricity begins to power whole cities. We have light at night. We can, of course, work past the sundown. Then steel, explosives, and finally, photography. Photography being one of the most important inventions for our purposes because it completely changes the role of art and what it means.
Within this backdrop, we have a series of revolutions that shake Europe to the core, upheavals that can be found in France, the German states, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. In France, not surprisingly, this is caused, just like in the revolutions that led to the downfall of Louis XVI, due to a food shortage that had lasted 2 years, since 1846. There was a recession leading to widespread unemployment among French men. The middle and lower classes wanted universal male suffrage. They wanted men to have the ability to vote, along with the freedom to speak in public and against the government and the freedom of assembly. Louis Philippe, the citizen king, would abdicate after 2 days of street fighting, and he would flee to Britain to save his own life. The Second Republic was then proclaimed as a provisional government at the time. Here we see Daumier, who's going to be satirizing the event with a street urchin in Louis Philippe's throne. And it says, "Christ, how softly you sink down in it," mocking the lower classes who now are going to be taking over for the citizen king, the monarch. Alphonse de Lamartine is going to lead the Second Republic, and as a poet, he attempts to restore order by creating national workshops like the WPA in America during the Great Depression. Now, he sets up these national workshops to provide temporary work for the jobless. Now, the unintended consequence of this was that the jobless flooded the capital, and these were forced to close, leading to more issues. The unemployed took to the streets with artisans, students, and employed workers, and are going to cause a great deal of violence in the bloody June days. Troops would be called, and they would kill 1,500 rebels and arrest 12,000 more. Some of these would be exiled to France's colony in Algeria. In its place, a military dictatorship was set in place of the Republican government until official elections could be held. Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, would be elected and would eventually become known as Napoleon III. He was elected president, but the Constitution of the Second Republic limited him to a non-renewable 4-year term. To prevent this, he staged a military coup in 1851, much like his uncle, thus terminating the Second Republic, replacing it, not surprisingly, with a military dictatorship. Less than a year later, he proclaimed himself emperor like his uncle and ruled until the Prussians invaded France in 1870. The provisional government, by way of art, was very sympathetic to the young artists who were not allowed to exhibit under the Graying Academy, as we discussed. Because of this, the government suppresses the jury in 1848, that being effectively taking the mechanism out of play that would prohibit them from exhibiting. And they had a record number of works thanks to that, 5,180. And as you might imagine, most were quite mediocre because there wasn't a selection process. Now, people at this time were more concerned with the revolution. Therefore, in 1849, a democratic organization happened in the Salon whereby artists selected the jury, not academicians. The Salon of 1849, 1850, and 51 were rolled together because of the political events in Paris at this time. Therefore, it's a better opportunity for innovative artists. The subjects of the events from 1848, for instance, would fall into two categories. One would be swept up in Republican enthusiasm, while the second would mourn the revolutionaries who had died and the atrocities that had occurred. The first contemporary picture can be seen here of these events, painted by a man who saw them firsthand, Jean-Louis Ernst Meissonier, in his Memory of Civil War of 1848. Here, he witnessed the artillery captain, that he's serving as an artillery captain in the National Guard. The cobblestones, as you see in the foreground, had been removed, right, to make a makeshift barricade. And the government troops had toppled it, shooting those rebels behind who had produced the barricade. Now, we find that in popular press at the time, we have images of what happened, showcasing the rebels, the barricade, as you see here off to the left, and then the soldiers that are knocking it down. Instead, now we are looking at the senseless death associated with the event. As we discussed earlier, instead of showcasing the heroic revolution, as in Liberty Leading the People of 1830, the symbol of the French Republic, we now have the sacrifice here, or the senseless death, the aftermath, not the troops, not the people uprising here, but instead showcasing the difference in how the French people viewed these two events. As we would describe the July Revolution as 3 glorious days, which were essentially bloodless. Now we have the Bloody June days that took place in 1848, which were terribly violent. So this is, in effect, a contemporary event. We are not looking at an allegory. We are not looking at a biblical narrative. This is something that just happened. And of course, we're recording these atrocities in a monochrome color palette with the sober realism here setting in. Not one that is romantic with a rich color palette, but one that is gray, gritty, and real. Now, this realness and emphasis on what's happening in the everyday is going to be thanks, arguably, to this man, Charles Baudelaire. He is an art critic and poet who would write a book-length review of the Salon of 1846, criticizing romantic and classical artists alike for depicting the past and not focusing on modern life. In his review on the heroism of modern life, he argues that artists should paint ordinary aspects of modern life and find grand epic quality in them. They should renounce allegories, nudity, and historical costumes, and instead show modern man in a dark suit and an overcoat, as he would say. These subjects, as we discussed at the end of last class, were quite common in prints and printmaking, but Baudelaire wanted it in a large-scale, massive context and of scale to be taken as seriously as history painting. Enter Gustave Courbet. Now, we find that Courbet is given the title of the father of realism. So critics writing about Courbet would state that realism is a democratic style of art for the common man by the common man. Now, detractors would condemn his art for its lack of poetry and of its academic polish. In the 1850s, Courbet would adopt the term, proclaiming himself as leader of this new movement. In 1855, after having his works repeatedly rejected from the Salon, he set up the Pavilion of Realism at the Paris International Exhibition to promote his work internationally. Now, importantly, Courbet would define this new movement of realism as only that which can be seen as real. That being in reality, no angels, no allegories, no historical figures. You need to be able to go out and see it at that time, at that day.
Now here in a massive anti-heroic work at 22 feet across, we have Courbet's The Burial at Ornans. Again, a straightforward presentation of something people would see outside of Paris in the countryside on any given day where someone is being buried. The anti-heroic scale, which is previously reserved for religious painting, showcases that it should be something very important, that being an historical event like Napoleon crossing the Alps, or a religious event like the crucifixion of Christ. Instead, we have identifiable people from Courbet's own village in Ornans. The three portraits to the right are his actual sisters, whereas the gravedigger kneels in the center over the hole he has just dug, with the priest reading from the office of the dead, and then the 6 pallbearers carrying the body to the far left. Now, the subject is not new. That being, we have seen these funeral scenes and processions, such as El Greco's The Burial of Count Orgaz, which does include actual portraits of people that were living at the time. But the scale is going to be reserved for history painting previously. For instead showing portraits at the bottom, but still promising that something happens after we lower this person into the ground, the promise of salvation above. There is none. In Courbet, we have a very dreary, overcast scene with a rocky plateau in the background. We do not have lush gardens or rolling hills. We have instead a very somber and depressing, straightforward approach to showing a funeral. Again, glorifying.
Again, as just mentioned with Meissonier, we have a monochromatic color palette which strips down the vibrancy in historical works to a gritty realism, as it were, a sober realism that is certainly not romantic. Therefore, if we look to Romanticism and Neoclassicism, equally condemned by Baudelaire, we can see that Romanticism would dramatize death, as in the death of Sardanapalus, whereas the Neoclassical painters would ennoble death, right? So both of these are academic in how they approach something that is certainly not noble. So here, in the early modern era, another way to understand it is that you would memorialize or heroize the deceased, promising us some salvation, something that happened in the hereafter. But realism and the realist approach shows death for what it is, a funeral where someone is lowered into the ground. Looking off into the background, nothing can be seen that is not present at this funeral. It is a bleak and desolate landscape, not promising of anything in the hereafter. Now, Courbet's friends compared this work to the medieval Dance of Death, which was popular in printmaking, showing us that death is going to lead the rich and the poor to the grave as the great equalizer. We all have to face death, no matter where we come from in life. So the Dance of Death is very popular, making a comedic or comical presentation out of this macabre subject, making light of it so we can come to grips with it. On the other hand, one critic actually noted that it reminded him of a very enlarged daguerreotype, with the rigidity of the group's bodies in the photo. Now here, another one would state that it looked like or resembled folk art. That was very common, as seen here with Napoleon's funeral procession from 1821 after he becomes a secular saint. So looking at not fine art examples, not from the academy, not from the salon, but outside of it with photography, folk art, and these popular traditions. So here, we should also note there is a bit of political fear when it comes to the criticisms levied against the burial at Ornans. It was criticized for being dull and boring and glorifying a trivial subject. Now, this, of course, should be put up against the backdrop of a new Republican regime, whereby we have a new provincial bourgeois class that could vote. Thus, this large mass of new voters are what we're looking at here in this new democratic art, as we have a uniformity of the dress, as everyone is equally important. Now, today, this painting hangs right next to it and was celebrated at the Salon of 1847, the last Salon of the July monarchy. So we can see, comparing the two, the major differences, the stark differences that contrast them at the time with Couture's Romans of the Decadence. Here, the Roman imperial scene is going to be one of a morning after a night of an orgy, of cavorting. And this is going to reconcile classicism and romanticism with the juste milieu, showing the middle ground here, one that would be appropriate for the middle class, thus looking down on the decadence and the debauchery of the Roman aristocracy. The excesses here of the nouveau riche of the middle class of the July monarchy are also on display. With the Roman Empire falling, as it was believed, due to the decadence of the ruling class, so too, at this time, will France fall, as is it believed, due to the excesses of the rich bourgeoisie. The revelers here are mockingly offering a drink to the statue of the Roman Republican hero in the upper right-hand corner. So we can see how these works are both going to comment on the middle class in different ways. So here we have a contemporary scene talking about the middle class versus an historical scene talking about the middle class. We have, again, a stiff lineup of motionless figures with Courbet's versus a dramatic composition with Couture's. Now, down below, we find that Courbet would state that historical art is by nature contemporary. So a very interesting comment on how to understand these works. However, the burial at Ornans showcases middle-class problems, not that of the poor. But this is what Courbet becomes known for and other artists in realism. So, we have Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is going to be the author of The Philosophy of Poverty of 1847, otherwise known as this belief in socialism, whereby society should be concerned about poverty and do something about it. So socialism is the economic system whereby social ownership of the means of production and cooperative management of the economy are all shared. So this is a transitional phase that leads us to communism, in which, of course, no one is actually going to own property or anything. So here, Louis Napoleon, who becomes Napoleon III, is also interested in the poor. In 1844, he writes The Extinction of Pauperism, which helped him win the election and presidency, showing that he was concerned with poverty. Finally, Karl Marx, who lived in France in the mid-1840s and supported socialism, is going to write his Communist Manifesto in 1848, whereby he's going to certainly be concerned about the poor, for communism would be a revolutionary socialist movement that creates a classless, moneyless, and stateless society that is structured upon common ownership in the means of production. Therefore, everyone owns everything, and at the same time, no one can then get a leg up on anyone else. So we don't have the poor as we would understand it, since we all are equal. This is going to be the backdrop in these three different treatises on poverty for the Stonebreakers of 1849, painted a year after the revolutions, and was exhibited with Ornans and 9 canvases produced for the Salon of 1850 and 51, those that were rolled up together.
in a very stark monochromatic color choice. We find that the figures are going to be shown in a very straightforward fashion and anonymously. They could be anyone in the working poor breaking rocks on the side of a road, which is the most unskilled labor that anyone can get, which is breaking larger rocks into smaller rocks, much as you might find people picking up trash on the side of the highway today. Not a very skilled activity. So you find that the young boy is going to have patched clothes, his shirt falling to tatters, and he actually is going to have suspenders holding up his oversized pants. The older man's vest jacket is tearing. Their poor meal can be seen off in the background to the right on this kettle, showing what they can afford to eat. All of which are very straightforward and
Again, we have a contemporary scene with a monochromatic palette, with figures that are certainly unidealized, unabashedly so. So we are here monumentalizing the common, making the figures that are insignificant heroic. Therefore, we have this anti-heroic approach as far as the scale is concerned.
So we find that the terms realism can be clearly differentiated from naturalism in that the most appreciated academic French painter, which American collectors also adored, Alphonse William Bouguereau, is going to paint images that are incredibly naturalistic. He is an excellent technician, and with oil painting is able to render and capture the effects of light coming through trees, the different textures, carefully observe nude models, all of which are very naturalistic and appear as though they would in reality. But this is not realism because, of course, one cannot see mythological figures like satyrs in reality. So you find that Gustave Courbet focuses only on that which can be seen.
Now, the early modern period and understanding of agriculture and labor, as seen here, would tie it to the ages of man or the agricultural calendar, something that is beyond the image itself. We're not merely monumentalizing or showing people doing work for the sake of it, like we are with Courbet.
Idealized, unembellished. So here, like Theodore Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, we have a contemporary event that, of course, could be seen, but it is entirely insignificant, right? So the Raft of the Medusa, no, these individuals are not wealthy, but it sparked a firestorm politically in France, and it was a very significant political event. So now we have these monumental figures with Courbet that lack any type of grand narrative. They're not going about being rescued. They're not surviving any great ordeal. They're just living their daily lives as the poor. And there is no moral value that can be added to it beyond this. It just is what it is, that being poor individuals working. Now, in glorifying the mundane, this becomes the hallmark of the modern moving forward with movements that come after realism like Impressionism.
As Courbet would note about the poor, alas, in that class, that is how one begins and that is how one ends up, showing how difficult it is to climb out of poverty. And even today, we can see the effects around the world. So this is showcasing sympathy and pity for the poor. Another artist who would use the poor and the laborers as the subject of his works would be Jean-Francois Millet, the son of a prosperous farmer from Normandy. Now, in 1848, he moved to Barbizon and became a neighbor of Rousseau, the landscape naturalist painter. Now, he lived in the countryside and preferred peasant subjects where he would heroize and monumentalize them. Here with The Sower, possibly his most famous work of 1850, we have an example of a common laborer who is sowing seed with his right hand, holding the satchel with his left. We find that he takes up the entire section of the portrait-oriented painting. He is anonymous, his eyes and his face in shadow, as we see this very deep chiaroscuro settling over the work itself. Comparing it to that of the Stonebreakers, we have two works that are anonymous by way of their subjects. They are valued, importantly, for their work that they are doing, not as individuals. So we find that Courbet is going to show sympathy for the poor in this instance. We pity them. Whereas Millet, on the other hand, demands our respect for the poor and how important their work is. So here we have a monumental figure that commands the earth with power and dignity. Now, critics were mixed on this because of their political biases. Conservatives called it socialist, that being calling attention to the poor was politically questionable. Progressives believed it showed a sense of social responsibility to the poor. Now, unfortunately, there was not a market for this type of painting at the time, nor really today, if we look at the most common paintings sold, because it is too radical for the state. They do not want to purchase this because it highlights the poor. It is also too dark and ugly for private collectors. They are going to appreciate picturesque landscapes, for instance. Now, in the 1840s, we find that Daumier begins painting alongside his printmaking efforts. And what he prefers to paint are the Parisian working class. Now, these were rarely exhibited in his lifetime and were made for himself. So here we have the heavy burden of 18 is going to be taking clothes to wash down to the river. So this is an unwed mother. They could not get work as domestic servants given their station as single moms. So in the summer and winter, they would bring laundry to the banks of the Seine with their children. So Daumier lived on the banks of the Seine and witnessed this, this occurrence of what they were doing, the backbreaking. So they lugged these wet laundry baskets back to their small, cramped residences to dry in these dank rooms, a very miserable existence at the time. Now, because this was hard and thankless work, many would turn to drink for solace, and we will see the same subjects cropping up again when we get to the Impressionists. So here we find that he would exaggerate the forms, just as he would for social and political satire, for a social message, showing how contorted and twisted the forms are as they're bending and pushing against the wind, trying to shoulder this heavy burden as the title suggests. So here we find, just like Courbet, it's showcasing how poverty is inescapable once you're born into it. It is a cycle that you pass down to your children. Now here, the heroic struggles can be seen in these two examples. Unlike Courbet, both Millet and Daumier are going to show how heroic these figures are. They are massive, heavy, strong figures. They are monumental, but they are still monochromatic with an increasingly suggestive technique that comes to define modern art. Now, in the mid-19th century, this is going to be a period of mass migrations in Europe and America. In Ireland, 1.5 million Irish immigrate to the Americas because of a potato famine that leaves many dead and starving between 1845 and 1848. In North America, 40,000 people are going to head to California during the gold rush of 1848, leading, of course, to the 49ers football team as well. Now, in France, we have 4,000 revolutionaries ordered to leave town after the Bloody June days. So showcasing that this was a period of refugees, we can see the fugitives here by Daumier of 1849 to 50, where refugees trudge aimlessly in a desolate landscape. They are anonymous, faceless, but they all go about the Elkerlijk, the everyman's journey through life. Here we have another example of that in sculpture, where they're shown nude rather than clothed. The classical character here showcases them as an allegory of human life as we march aimlessly from birth to death. So this is, in Daumier's estimation, the human condition. Both of these taken together showcase, again, not the rich, not significant, not powerful historical figures, but instead the opposite. Those that are impoverished, that have no political power, that have no home, as we understand it, that are going to be trudging through life, just as those that are born into poverty die in it. These are the subjects of realism and realist painters. Next time, we will continue on with the Second Empire and Napoleon III, looking at his contributions to culture between 1852 and 1870.